Welcome, and thank you for choosing Get Smart for your concealed carry course. If this is your first time to obtain your concealed carry permit, or this is a renewal class for you, welcome. We're really proud of the decision that you have made to better protect yourself and your loved ones. We will take this course in 3 parts. To begin with, think smart, act smart, and get smart. The think smart really has to do with understanding the nuts and bolts of the gun, the parts, cleaning, clearing, safety, storage, children, and all of those things that pertain to the firearm itself. Act smart is understanding you, being the right kind of person, having the right mindset, and where we carry on our person. That's important. Where we carry out in public. That's super important too. The think smart is understanding the laws, because it's one thing to know how to carry. It's a whole nother thing to make sure that we do it right. And if we do have to pull the trigger, what are the laws of your state pertaining to such an action? So we are going to cover all of those. We're going to begin with Think Smart. First of all, we kind of need to explain that this video is broken up into 3 parts. We did that on purpose so that a person can come back and watch one of the parts that they feel like they need refreshing. It also allows us to update the laws as those things come down the pike. After finishing, be sure to attest. That's also where you take care of your prepayment. Allow 2 days for us to send out your certificate to you. That's 2 business days. And we build that in just in case there's a holiday or something comes up. We're usually a lot faster than that. Do check your junk or spam folder. Occasionally we hear from people that it got hung up there. And then occasionally we can send them out and your server can still end up blocking our email. So we'll make sure that we work around that. So call us if 2 business days rolls around and you haven't heard from us. Then you'll go apply at your local law enforcement to obtain your concealed carry. I love the common sense that politicians used to have. Thomas Jefferson, one of my heroes, in the Commonplace book he wrote, "The laws that forbid the carrying of arms are laws of such a nature, they disarm only those who are neither inclined nor determined to commit crimes." I'm assuming that's you. "Such laws make things worse for the assaulted and better for the assailants. They serve rather to encourage than to prevent homicides, for an unarmed man may be attacked with greater confidence than an armed man." And that is the whole point of why we're doing what we do. We hope we never need this, but if we do, thank God we have it. So firearms actually account for less than 1% of accidental deaths. It is because a firearm got into the hands of an unauthorized individual, be it a criminal or a child, or that being one and the same, or negligence or ignorance. The gun won't just go off on its own, of course. So we encourage people, be familiar with your firearm, run hundreds of rounds through it with practice ammo, run dozens of rounds through it with your self-defense rounds because they don't feed the same, and then practice pulling from your draw, your concealed position hundreds of times, no ammunition around, but just practice pulling from that concealed position. Make sure you're not getting hung up in your shirt, releasing the safety, presenting, and then you can just say bang if you don't want to pull the trigger. Otherwise, get little snap caps and put in there so you're not dry firing your gun against no cartridge. The point is, by the time we are attacked by an individual, not an active shooting scenario necessarily, but one-on-one, we consider that it probably didn't just come about with somebody coming up to you and pulling out a gun, but probably there is some pushing and shoving and some yelling and spitting and all of this good stuff. But by the time they reach back or forward, wherever they keep their peace, and they pull out their firearm, we've got 3.5 seconds to respond. 3.5 seconds. If in that 3.5 seconds I have not already figured out where my gun is without looking at it, how to pull it out without getting all tangled up in my shirt, how to release the safety, and how to present and shoot in 3.5 seconds, that's not going to fare well for me. Especially once they see you're pulling something out. If their intent wasn't to shoot, and of course we never know intent, by this time they will, because then they feel threatened. So practice, practice, practice. All right. We owe a great deal of gratitude to the NRA. Decades of fighting for our freedom, lobbying on behalf of good, legal, safe gun owners. And so we'll use some of their pictures and definitely using their core curriculum from their basic pistol course. First thing that they like to remind people, so do I, is to keep the gun pointed in a safe direction, much like number 4, knowing your target and what is beyond. So if you're at the range, that's taken care of. If you're shooting outdoors and shooting into a berm, that's taken care of. We are thinking now about if we're in the house or in an active shooting scenario. We've got people running behind the attacker. We've got people running between you and the assailant. We've got people behind you. All of these people that are innocent could end up getting caught in a crossfire if we're not careful. We also think about a home invasion. If we're alone with the assailant, well, who's on the other side of that wall? Sleeping children? Who's next door? Full Metal Jacket goes through hollow doors and glass and screens and even whatever pretty easily. So we just really need to be aware of our surroundings. Secondly, there is to always keep our finger off the trigger until ready to use. So even if I had to sweep through the house, and we'll talk about that in the third video here, whether what makes sense there and what kind of movement is important. But if I did have to, my finger is always on the side of the frame until I'm ready to shoot. Always, always, always. This causes a reactionary gap, which causes my mind to have to tell my finger this is a threat, rather than the proverbial accident taking place when really it was just somebody coming in to surprise me. And if my finger is on the trigger, that knee-jerk reaction may cause me to be trigger happy too soon. All right, and then of course keeping the firearm unloaded until ready to use. This is not talking about my firearm for home defense or the one on my person, inside the waistband, or wherever else I'm carrying. That one is loaded and it is ready to use. That is the whole point of self-defense. This is talking about all my other guns in storage. All right, so this is basic, and we're going to ask you to join us with this little process here to name the parts of the pistol. Of course, the tube that projects out the front of the gun is the barrel. The frame is the chassis upon which everything's attached. The action speaks of all of the moving parts that must work in concert for the firearm to fire. We've got the ejector rod, which kicks out the spent casings after they've been shot. The trigger, of course. The cylinder, which is essentially your magazine. You've got your hammer, and then the lesser known name, hammer spur. We've got the cylinder release latch. So if we're dealing with a revolver, best practice is we hold this with our right hand, even if we're left-handed. Push the mechanism, which is the release latch. Use these 2 fingers to push against that cylinder. That way we're pushing it out evenly. The trigger guard, and then we have the front strap. Not commonly known until you say, what is this? Well, that's the back strap. Oh, okay, front strap, back strap. Makes sense. Grip panels, got your rear sight. Where you have a rear sight, you have a front sight. And then we need a spot for the bullets to come out. We'll call this the muzzle. All the twisty turning inside of the barrel is called rifling. It's made up of lands and grooves. And then with any firearm, the next round is waiting to be fired in the chamber. All right. What I'd like to do for a second here is to take a look at a cross section and a cutaway of the rifling. We see it puts a spin on the bullet. Couple things happens there. Mostly it's that physical dynamic of it exiting. Puts a spin on it. We call it trajectory. It keeps it in balance. It helps with distance, speed, accuracy. I mentioned balance because it's more aerodynamic. It also causes this thing called striation. I'm not sure how well you can see this, but this is a bullet after it's been shot. And when you watch CSI or other movies where they employ forensic and ballistics, there we go, there's a good shot. It leaves those grooves on there, and those are like fingerprints, unique for every gun. The difference between your single action and your double action is that the single action has to be cocked before the hammer has to be cocked before you pull the trigger every single time. Your double action does both actions. As you pull back, it pulls back the hammer for you and releases it. As we considered the cowboy gun or the single action, probably not the best gun for home defense because of that extra step of having to pull back the hammer. Nonetheless, whatever you have, you have. But all the parts are mainly the same until we consider how we load it. So if the cylinder swings out, as in the one that I shared with you here, we're always dealing with the double action. Your single action is never swung out like that. Most of the time they had this loading gate, as we see in this picture, where this gate opens up, and then we have to half cock the hammer in order for the cylinder to freely turn, and then we load it single at a time, single action, single load. Now there's always exceptions, so there were some double actions that also loaded that way early on. Some of them even broke from the top, exposing all of the cylinders. But essentially, that's what we're dealing with. That's mostly a single action. Also, the other thing to note is when we look at the trigger down here, look how close that is to the trigger guard. We didn't have to have that long trigger pull, and we only needed like, I don't know, 3 pounds of pressure to fire the firearm because we did all the heavy lifting already with our thumb. But with that double action, you usually see the hammer riding more in the middle because you have to have that long trigger pull and that long travel in order for the hammer to get where it needs to be in order to fire. Well, the benefits of the revolver is definitely more simple to use. I guess I would say that's one of these and it's one of these because we've had a couple instances in the last couple of years where toddlers have pulled revolvers out of mom's purse and have shot mom. Very sad stories. That's why it's incumbent upon us as the grown-ups to make sure that we maintain positive control of our firearms. Sad stories nonetheless. But if you're the person needing to use the gun to defend yourself against an aggressive attacker, then simple is the name of the game. It's easier to determine if it's loaded. So when we look at the clearing it, anytime you pass a firearm off to another individual, you want to stop, make sure that you both know that it's clear or not cleared. If you're at the range, of course, it's still clearing it if you're checking to make sure if it's loaded or not. But a revolver that swings out like this, very transparent, very easy to see that it's empty, and so that's a positive. I guess the downside is that they're bulkier and you have less capacity and it takes longer to reload. But some people prefer their revolvers. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the semi-automatic. Most of the parts are the same. So we've got the barrel, the frame, the action, which would be the slide, and of course all the moving parts within. We have the trigger, the slide, and then there'll be up to 3 mechanisms on the side of the firearm here, and these devices do different things, of course. This first one is the takedown lever or takedown lever, as we often say in America, and this is to disassemble the gun to take the slide off of the frame in order to clean it or maintain it. The second one there is your slide lock. So we talked about clearing the revolver here a second ago. When we think about a semi-automatic, not as transparent as the revolver, so we would want to clear this also, but in a 2-step process rather than the one. First, we want to drop the magazine, and then we want to lock it open. The reason why I did in that order, of course, is if I locked it open and then closed the breech and then dropped the magazine, I may have inadvertently loaded it. But at this point, then I'm going to visually inspect. I don't need to stick my finger in there because I don't want this to close on me, and there's no need to. I would see if there's a cylinder in a cartridge in the back of the cylinder there. The chamber, excuse me, it's not a cylinder. The second thing I'm going to do is do a little physical check. Now here, in a bright room, you can see right through there. You can see the light of day and know that there's no magazine in there. But if I'm in a dimly lit room, most magazines are black, most grips are black. Black on black looks like maybe nothing's there. I think I'm free and clear. So do a visual and then a physical, and then you're good to go to pass that firearm on to another individual. The hammer spur, safety, which may be here, it may be in the trigger, it may be on the side of the slide, it may be in the back strap, or there may not be one at all. And people ask me sometimes if that would bother me to have a gun without a safety. Absolutely not. As long as I'm carrying it holstered and that holster is properly covering the trigger. That said, there are holsters that do not properly cover the trigger. I could list them out by name, but maybe I don't have enough insurance to do that on this video. So we'll just say if it's not covering the trigger, it's not a holster. It's a holding device. And that has no place for carrying a gun, especially one without a safety. All right, so this is a magazine. This is a magazine release. That's not a clip, as people often call them. A clip would feed a magazine for a machine gun. All right, so benefits of a semi-automatic is they can be smaller. So this is a little 380, very thin. If I'm not planning on, wearing clothes where I could hide it, hide a larger gun, I might want to grab this just a quick in and out of the house because I always want to have something with me. And I could hide this in a dozen places on my body. If I want greater capacity, that's also another benefit. So this little gal here could carry 17 in the magazine, one up in the chamber, versus the 6+1 in the little 380. Or I could carry multiple magazines, of course. That's always a good thing. And I could easily conceal this in half a dozen places. Not quite as versatile as the smaller one. But the downside is that it's more complicated and it does tend to jam more. So if you're a person who tends to shoot with somebody that you consider to be more experienced and your gun jams and you always hand the gun to that person and ask them to clear it, I really want to encourage you to rethink that. Consider that jamming as a blessing, maybe call it a fire drill, that you had the opportunity to clear that as quickly and safely as possible and get right back online to continue shooting. Because in an active shooting scenario, the person who's helping you today might not be there tomorrow. All right. So engaging this safety, does it give 100% guarantee that the gun will not fire? No, it does not. So we treat every gun like it's loaded, every safety like it's off. How often should we clean our guns? Well, every time we shoot them, and then not a bad idea to shoot a couple rounds through it after that because you had everything out of it. You had the whole thing apart. I'm sure you did a great job of putting it back together, but this is the device that's intended to save your life and protect your family, so shooting a couple rounds through it isn't a bad thing. Safety considerations when cleaning: just don't have the ammunition around. A couple guys that are rotting in jail right now learned that important lesson, shooting their wives while cleaning their guns at the kitchen table. Slightly suspicious. What also may happen is you might take a phone call and you have little kids in the house. They come up. A lot of kids' games are established by putting things where they belong. I've seen mom and dad do this. This is really cool. Not so cool. You also may bump your solvent. If your ammo's there, if it bleeds in the bottom of your box, it's going to render it potentially ineffective. And who wants to walk around with ammunition that might or might not work? So, no ammunition around. Speaking of kids, this is a general rule for most states. Kids under 18 may use a firearm if supervised by an adult. Now, that could be Boy Scouts or ROTC. However, I think some of these things are best taught by parents. Good, educated, smart, thinking, communicating parents. Spending time with their kids to let them know that firearms are not taboo. And, we start with their age-appropriate firearm. Airsoft, BB gun, 22s. But the point is we get them comfortable with them and instruct them if they ever find a random gun somewhere, not to touch it, but to go tell an adult. We don't want their little fingerprints on something that might be the object of a crime. All right, couple more things here. Cartridge versus bullet. This whole thing is called a cartridge. Thanks to the Lone Ranger, we call the whole thing the bullet, but technically the bullet's just in the front. So consider this to be my gun. I pull the trigger. The hammer hits the firing pin, which hits the primer, and the primer actually has enough spark in it to dislodge the bullet from the casing, but there wouldn't be enough to send it sailing down range. So we have powder charge in there that when the primer ignites the powder charge, it expands very quickly and therefore pushes the bullet out of the casing. We have two different kinds of cartridges. So we've got rimfire, which most commonly is the 22, could be 17 as well. But as you kind of see here, it's just really smooth. and the primer is on the edge of the rim, so you don't really see anything. Versus the center fire, you see where that primer is and exactly where that hammer and the firing pin are going to hit. Make sure, of course, at all times that we're using proper ammunition. I've had stories, thankfully didn't amount to any harm, but people using wrong ammunition at the range, but it never fares well. Next is when we look at ammunition and extensions that go on the back of them, call them credentials. Sometimes they have plus P or plus P plus or Magnum, and certainly that speaks of higher pressure or more power, right? But if your gun is not designed for it, you'll quickly destroy your gun. So you really want to make sure if you start getting into plus P or plus P plus or Magnum that you have a gun that is designed for that. The next thing has to do with caliber, and now we're kind of talking about the diameter from one side of the bullet to the other side of the bullet. We deal with metric and we deal with standard foot and inches, right? And they don't, I mean, it's not logical. They don't go across the aisle there, so to speak. So the quick way to do a calculation is to take the metric times 4, and that gets you over into the standard. So a 9mm, take that times 4, gets us over to 36. Sorry, I knew the answer. I was just looking for something. So a 9mm versus a 38 special, a 9mm is slightly smaller, except that's a 380. A 9mm is slightly smaller than a 38 special. Now your 38 special and your 380 are identical in caliber. They're just a different length. So your 38 special is almost twice as long as your 38 380. So kind of helps with nomenclature and how to calculate that a little bit. So we have discussed the cartridge and the difference between center fire and rim fire, the different pieces, the primer, the powder, the casing, the bullet. And then we also talked about the caliber from one side of the bullet to the other. Lastly, let's talk about the shape of the heads or the bullets. So these wad cutters are good for people who are trying to qualify for marksmanship programs because they leave really a perfect hole, like a paper hole punch, versus that iconic bullet hole where the corners are ripped out. They look like triangles. It makes a great tattoo, but not really good if you're trying to do your marksmanship qualifying. But not necessary to spend the extra money just for going to the range. You just would want to use full metal jacket or the lead round nose for that, because relatively speaking, it's the cheapest ammunition. The hollow points, on the other hand, those are really great for your personal defense, because as we see, versus this round that I showed you a little bit earlier, this hits something hard, really, really hard to dent like that, but it just still stayed as one big fat piece of metal. And this would essentially go through the assailant, and it could go through a couple pieces of drywall and doors and blah, blah, blah. I talked about that already. Your hollow point will open up upon impact. So it'll have the greatest stopping power for the assailant. We remember that wounded people continue to shoot, and at the end of the day, both people might end up losing, the attacker and the good guy defending himself. So this gives the quickest response for stopping the threat for sure. Also, when we think about missed shots or pass through, we don't have to worry so much, well, we do, but about what's on the other side of that wall. We still need to worry about it, but it loses a lot of the inertia when it opens up upon the first entry of that wall. Oh, and by the way, we know this. Shooting straight up in the air is unsafe and stupid, so don't, even on the 4th of July. Moving on. Ammunition should be stored in a cool, dry place, not in a hot or dirty or damp environment. And for our firearms that we are not shooting, I mentioned this earlier, they should be separated from the firearm, both locked up separately, just to avoid break-ins, things like that. This is not talking about your firearm that you're using for home defense, which is loaded, but probably locked near your bedstand. Fundamentals of shooting. Really encourage you. There's no way to do this in an online course, but get together with somebody who you consider to be proficient at shooting and help them out have them help you out with your grip, stance, breath control, trigger squeeze, follow through, all of that. The one thing that's different is sight alignment, is just pointing your finger and shooting when we come to self-defense, versus the sport where you're focusing on that front sight, everything else is blurry, you're worried about eye dominance. None of that happens with self-defense. It's point, it's shoot. So in conclusion, NRA reminds us, keep our firearm pointed in a safe direction, always keep our finger off the trigger until ready to shoot, keeping it unloaded until ready to use. The gun I'm using and carrying is ready to use. And then know your target and what is beyond. Now don't forget, there's 2 more videos in this series. Make sure that you go to those in order to complete your process to obtain your concealed carry. Thank you for joining us. Talk to you soon.